We've got a really great panel here to kind of dive into some of the themes that we've been talking about today. And our goal is to really make this a conversation with everyone here, but also to make it a conversation with all of you. So we're going to be opening it up nice and early for questions. Please get those questions ready. I'd like to introduce our panelists. Closest to me is Noah Diffenbaugh. He's an associate professor in the School of Earth Sciences at Stanford and a senior fellow at the Stanford Wood Institute for the Environment. He focuses on the interface of climate dynamics and climate impacts, including extreme weather, water, agriculture, and human health. And he's a lead author for Working Group 2. Charles Kolstad is a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research and at the Precourt Institute. He works on the economics of climate change and environmental regulation, and he's a lead author for Working Group 3. Terry Root is a senior fellow at the Stanford Wood Institute for the Environment. She primarily conducts research on how animals and plants are changing with climate change, with a focus on mass extinction. She's a review author for Working Group 2, and she's been a lead author on several past assessments. And then John Krosnick is the Frederick O. Glover Professor in Humanities and Social Sciences, a professor of communication and of political science, and a senior fellow at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. He focuses on the psychology of attitudes and political behavior, and for the past few decades has surveyed the American public's views of climate change. Also of note, he is headlining the reception this evening with his jazz band, Charged Particles, so good to know. So to start us off, I wanted to ask a few questions of our three folks that have worked on these past reports, and then talk to John a little bit more about the public. So to start us out, my editors at KQED, when I'm pitching them a story, they like to torture me with, well, what's the one sentence, right? What's the one sentence about why this story should be covered? So now when I'm in the driver's seat, I get to torture them. Looking at this assessment, if you were going to share your takeaway, your kind of one sentence, maybe with somebody who doesn't know much about climate change or doesn't follow it, what would that one sentence be that you could share? Someone has to volunteer to go first here. So.
Well, I think for Working Group 2, we heard the detailed version this morning, which was really really great summary. I think my one sentence would be that global warming is happening. It's causing changes in the climate, and we now know that those changes in the climate are increasing the risk of extreme events and impacts in the ocean and on land.
That was one. Sure.
Well, one could use a very compounded sentence to answer this question, but I won't. I think the message from all three working groups.
I think the microphone isn't working.
Well, are you guys? Is it on now? Okay. I don't control the on-off switch. So the message from the three working groups is, as I see it, and I'm on the third one, which is concerned with actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The message is that the impacts are real, the physical science is real, and the costs are manageable to do something about it. Now, exactly what we do about it, I think we're still short of specificity on that. But the idea that doing nothing is a desirable option seems to be off the table, at least according to the results of the IPCC.
And what I would end up, okay, I'm on. Okay, what I would end up saying is that we really are going to hit 2 degrees Celsius above industrial. And we need to be worried about hitting that 2 degrees. We know we're already warming. We're going to go up at least to 2 degrees. And there's already impacts, and the burning embers showed us what is actually going to happen with 2 degrees. And it's not something that we can deal with very easily. And what we need to do is start working a lot faster than we are now. And that came out in Working Group 3, actually, too.
So I always get a little bit nervous when the assessments come out, because I feel like one of these times it's going to be a one-pager that says, sorry, it's too late.
It's never too late.
Is it too late? What kind of changes are we locked into at this point? Is it too late to avoid some of the worst ones? Maybe we'll start with that.
Sure. Well, so I was So I was one of the authors on the North America chapter, and in terms of physical climate, we know that the extreme heat events are increasing. We know that heavy rainfall events are increasing. We know that extreme storm surges from landfalling storms are increasing. So really, the risk. We heard this morning about that, about the risk, the interaction between physical hazard, and exposure and vulnerability. We know that risk is increasing from increasing extreme events, and I think as Terry said, it's never too late. The question is really what's the risk? How do we manage those risks? There certainly are. There's real potential for nonlinearities in the climate system. So, there are countries that are low-lying island states in particular that are at a real risk of disappearing entirely, and in terms of land above sea level. And that's an existential kind of change. It's different when you have land above sea level. It's different from when you don't have land above sea level. I mean, that's kind of a hard threshold. So there are some examples where it really is different when you cross the line, and certainly the land ice. We heard about the land ice this morning, mobilization of large ice sheets and really mobilizing a lot of water, frozen water from land into the ocean. That's another area where there are real differences above and below a threshold. And in another case, it's really a question of likelihoods and even for extreme events, it's not as clear that above or below 2 degrees C or 3 degrees C is going to be appreciably fundamentally different, but that we do see with increased global warming increasing risk of those high impact events.
Let me just add that I think in some sense it is too late to have no climate change, even though technically everything is possible. And what we're talking about is living with some level of climate change, but another finding is that the longer we wait to decide what we want to do, as long as we keep dithering about it, that's only going to run up the costs and the impacts from action when we actually eventually take it. So that's a subtly different message than doing something about it. Doing it now is better than doing it in 2020 or 2030.
Well, I work on how plants and animals are affected by climate change, and I'm asked all the time after my talks, how do you keep doing what you're doing when it is so depressing? And do you have hope? I keep saying, if I didn't have hope, I'd go to Disneyland. We always are going to have hope. The thing is that if we had started when I started this is basically in 1985, if we had started then, we wouldn't be losing as many species as we're losing now. If we start now, we're going to lose a lot fewer species than if we start later. So what we need to do is really start. We already have lost species. We already have had extinctions. They're irreversible, and there are a lot of species that are marked for extinction. They may not be extinct right now, but unless humans go in and help them and manage them, we're going to lose them. And in the past IPCC, not this one, but the last one, said if you go up to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial, which I said earlier, that's basically what we are going to do, we could lose between 20 and 40% of the known species on the planet. 20% of the known species is 400,000 species. What they said before is if we go up to 4 degrees above pre-industrial, we could lose half. If we were to lose half the species, that's equivalent to a mass extinction event. And I'm not sure, well, there are two aspects of this. First of all, is the moral one. Does one species really have the right to cause the extinction of so many other species? But the other one is there are a lot of species that are going to go extinct that we need to stay alive. So what the IPCC is saying is we have got to get started. We don't have much time. Let's get going. And we really can do a lot to save the planet. There are some things we can't do. They're already gone.
John, with the drought in California this year, the question I've probably gotten the most from friends and family is, well, is this climate change? And it occurs to me, for most of the general public, climate change really comes up very sporadically, not that often. And you've kind of looked at this, what does the public think? What's the trend there? And do reports like this one, this assessment, do these kind of releases, do they move the needle at all in terms of attitudes?
Well, it's a great question, and we've been, of course, tracking American public opinion now for more than 15 years to look at the impact not only of the recent drought in California, but Hurricane Katrina and Al Gore's movie and lots of other events that happened during that time period that certainly did one of the things you mentioned, which is to bring Americans' focus a little bit more on the issue than it might have been otherwise. And secondly, to provide a different array of information. Many of us in this room were in Memorial Hall years ago when Al Gore came to Stanford and delivered his address before the movie was released. And many of us walked out of that room shaking our heads thinking, if just once during our career we could give a talk as good as that, in the sense that it was just, there was so much data and it gradually accumulated, making such a compelling case on the scientific side. And I don't know if this is true, but I think maybe the very beginning of the movie is a shot from a camera behind him of a dark room in which many of us were sitting, actually. But the visibility that movie brought to the issue, as far as we can tell, had absolutely no impact on Americans' opinions because the majority of Americans were already on what you might call the green side of the issue. And that's been true for Hurricane Katrina. It was true when Democratic President Barack Obama stood with Republican Governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, after Superstorm Sandy and said this was a climate change related event. If anything, we saw concern about climate change drop a little bit after that. And you might say, why the heck would that happen? Well, the signal there that was new is not that climate change is happening or that climate change can cause storms or severe storms. That was new is Republicans and Democrats were suddenly in agreement on that issue. It only lasted 15 seconds, but still it was, there was that moment.
That was okay.
And that said to Americans, okay, don't worry as much, it's being addressed. And that whether it is or isn't is debatable, but that's what was new there. And so I don't actually see any evidence in our own research that these events have had any more than small impact, but it's in part because Americans in some ways are ahead of some skeptics on the issue in largely embracing the issues and don't need to be convinced.
And kind of adding to that, things that are kind of end up in the public sphere, that Showtime series, maybe some of you have seen it, Years of Living Dangerously just came out. And in the New York Times last week, there was an op-ed from the Breakthrough Institute that criticized that series. The gist of it was that scare tactics, by focusing on natural disasters, it was actually going to backfire, that it was going to create more polarization. I'm kind of curious to get your take on that op-ed and their point there.
Yeah, as some people in the room may know, that op-ed was the subject of attack by others who called it into question. I actually myself am more on the side of the op-ed than those who attacked it. I think there not only have lots of events happened over the last 15 years that could have provoked a change that didn't, that you just say before you even watch that program, you'd say, well, why would a television series change public opinion on the issue? But what's new about this? Well, the hook of Years of Living Dangerously is that there are lots of famous movie stars, George Clooney, and others of his ilk, going around the world talking to scientists and ordinary people to illustrate both the impact of climate change on the planet. For example, Arnold Schwarzenegger is trudging around Colorado, I think, looking at wildfires. And in addition, showing the human impact of the issues of, for example, there's an episode that involves the tension between, I think, a father and a daughter who are on opposite sides of the issue and how much strife this has caused within a single family. So it illustrates in vivid ways, I think, more so than an IPCC report can or a single news story, the sort of human side of it, but also sort of making vivid those wildfires and talking in depth to firefighters who say, we're just doing this a lot more than we used to be doing it. There is something new about that. Is it going to change the needle in the planet, in the country? I doubt it.
So the obvious question, and I don't know that anyone up here has the answer, how do we move the needle then? You know, what are these moments that make people engage the issue in a way where they haven't?
I'd like to hear what John says about that. What has moved the needle in
Yeah,
it?
has there?
Well, I think the answer, for us to begin to answer your question, I think we all have expertise to address it, is we got to decide which needle are we trying to move. And I think so many people over the last 2 decades have thought that the needle we need to move is the public. And to me personally, the data don't support that. The data suggests that the public is as much on the side of legislation on this issue as it has been on many other issues where our government has acted. So the question is, why is government not acting? And some people have drawn a parallel, of course, to the tobacco industry and have said there is a large corporate interest in maintaining the status quo of generating electricity from fossil fuels. There's infrastructure that's been invested in. And so there's a reluctance to abandon those investments at the same time that there's a reluctance to give up on inexpensive and largely supplied fuels. So if that's sort of the force that's pushing against this, we now know in California and elsewhere in the country eventually, public smoking became illegal. Wasn't for a long time, and it became illegal. What happened there? Well, I think one of the key things that happened in that case is that we as a country came to recognize that what the tobacco companies knew and hid for a long time, the efforts at deceiving the public, maintaining an air of uncertainty when there really wasn't uncertainty about the health risks of smoking. So the question is, if the needle we really want to move is government policy, if we are interested in seeing cap and trade legislation passed or mandates passed, or to see utilities change the way they're generating electricity, it's the folks who are making those decisions who matter. And one argument you could make is that they're not as aware of where the public is as they could be. Use the public as pressure. And so, for example, if we've done news media content analyses to compare the degree to which news stories cover what my colleagues do in this arena versus what people like me do in this arena, their work gets a lot more attention. And you might argue another story about more species becoming extinct may not be news to politicians, but maybe leading them to confront the reality of public opinion would be more consequential. That's a hypothesis. But alternatively, you might say, well, what is really keeping them where they are? And we need to address that directly.
But we also have to remember that maybe the federal government isn't doing much, but the state governments, the city governments, the county governments, they're doing a lot. So to say that the U.S. doesn't really have a policy on climate change, it's true nationally, but it's not true at the local level, and that may be where the people are really coming into force here. Yeah.
Let me just take that segue and talk about California. I think that the fact that something like 65% of the state's population voted in favor of keeping the AB 32, which is the greenhouse gas regulations in the state when it was up for a proposition to defeat it a couple of years ago, it sort of indicates the public support. I think that a big question a lot of people have is what is it going to do to my job, the economy, lots of dimensions of that, maybe the cost of me commuting from the high desert in LA down to where I work in central LA, if that's the question. Some of those questions are, I think, still bothering some people, and I think one of the real advantages of the California experiment, if you want to call it that, because it really won't change the total global amount of emissions all that much, but it'll demonstrate the extent to which a big political entity, state of California, can reduce its emissions without causing a lot of economic disruption. And I think that'll actually have a lot of implications far beyond the state of California when people see that it can be done, because it really hasn't been done anywhere else in the world.
And just to kind of unpack, we talked a little bit before today about, sticking to the 2°C goal, not being quite as expensive. It's gotten a lot of focus lately, right? That it isn't quite maybe as large a number as people thought. Charles, can you unpack that a little bit more? Is it that technology like solar is getting cheaper? I mean, why is that number kind of where it is, or maybe lower than people thought it might be?
Well, there are two numbers in there in the report. One is, I think Chris Field talked about it this morning, a hit of 0.06 percentage points out of 3 percentage points, which we all know isn't very much at all, on economic growth over the rest of the century. The other number is that in 2100, it'll take as much as 12% of our income to mitigate climate change, which is a bigger number. And it all depends on how you look at it. Things are lower in the first half of the century, and then they get more expensive later in the century. The costs are there, but what is clear is that if the cost for 2 degrees is considered too much, then the costs for 3 degrees are quite a bit less. And there is a number there of controlling the problem where the costs are not that high. Some people think the 2 degree number, which is that 0.06, is fine. Other people will prefer an even lower number. So I think how one interprets the cost is a little difficult to say whether it's nothing or a lot. But the point is there are choices, and you can make a good choice, and that choice is not to do nothing.
I think another aspect of that is we're still learning how to integrate the costs that we're experiencing now, right? So one of the breakouts is focused on extreme events, and part of the discussion was about attributing extreme events to the global warming that's already occurred. And we're getting the point scientifically where this is a tractable problem. We are really able to ask an objective hypothesis framework, what's the likelihood of this kind of event? What would that likelihood have been without global warming? And if we look at recent events in the United States, for example, the extreme storm surge inundation that occurred during Hurricane Sandy, the work that's been done on that event suggests that the sea level rise that's already occurred has almost doubled the likelihood of that extreme storm surge for exactly the same storm. If we look at the extreme heat that occurred in the central and eastern United States in the summer of 2012, it's about a 4-fold increase in likelihood from the global warming that's already occurred. These are multi-billion-dollar events, and we're already experiencing increased risk. What we don't really have our head around yet is how to add up the cost of those events into this price of carbon, and what the cost of avoiding the future global warming might be. So as Chris said earlier, when he was talking about the cost of mitigation, he said, well, if there's no impact from climate change, then here's how that would be. But if you integrate the cost of climate change, then that changes what your cost benefit accounting would be quite a bit. And I think we're at the point scientifically, because we can credibly calculate the likelihood of these extreme events and how that likelihood has changed with global warming, we're at the point where we can start to integrate the damages that we see on a year-to-year basis from those kinds of events.
Noah, you've definitely done some studies that we've covered at KQED because they've been regionally focused, right? Focused on some California impacts. I'm always curious after I hang up the phone and file my story, do you get more engagement from decision makers or folks in California? Because the impacts are maybe more tangible to Californians, do you get feedback as opposed to maybe a global study or a national study?
Yeah, I would say that John's comments about current extreme events notwithstanding, that since you asked about where I feel like I get my emails and phone calls from the outside world, it's really when there's an extreme event that's happening somewhere. And is this global warming? I can see it. It's happening over my house right now. Is this, it's over DC right now. Is this global warming? We're usually, we've come a long way, but we're still at the point where we're 6 to 12 months, behind the event in doing that kind of analysis. But yeah, there seems to be a spike in interest around particular extreme events. Certainly the California drought, this is a question we're getting almost on a daily basis, and we're literally doing the science right now to try to understand it, and we're juggling both of those.
So what do you tell people about the drought?
Well, I guess, let's see who's in the room here. So, I mean, I say what I usually say, which is that it's a matter of ongoing research, and you know, we're trying to figure it out. But
That's a cop-out, Noah. Come on now.
well, so I mean, I'd be happy to have a discussion about the, yeah, what kind of, you know, what kind of information is most useful to decision makers.
Right.
My view is that that scientifically accurate, objective information is most actionable. But you know, there's no doubt that with the current drought, most of what we've seen in terms of the precipitation deficit and the snowpack deficit is due to you know, this very abnormal atmospheric feature, the ridiculously resilient ridge. Daniel Swain was here earlier. He coined that term. He's a grad student here.
It's very hard to say on the air, so I'm going to find that guy.
You can call it the triple R. So we've seen this rare atmospheric feature. We actually understand really well that if that's the atmospheric condition, it's going to be dry in California. Like that connection is well understood. You know, I think that where we really can get a lot of insight about global warming and impacts in California from the current event is with the snowpack, and whether the low snowpack now is due to the lack of precipitation or the warm conditions. In either case, this is the kind, you know, we're in April now, we have very low snowpack. We have very high confidence that we're likely to see this kind of snowpack starting in the spring and summer much more frequently as a result of global warming. And so I think what we see this spring and this summer in terms of impacts on ecosystems, wildfire, water supply in the western U.S. is very much what we can infer is likely to occur with continued global warming.
Thinking about kind of California as this maybe little incubator of policies, Terry, last summer I was down at the Ivanpah solar plant, right? It's this massive concentrated solar plant that kind of just opened up. It was one of the first that kind of came about because of California's aggressive renewable portfolio standard. I'm curious kind of in your work, you know, you have the renewable portfolio standard, right, with definitely passed with climate in mind, and then you have a number of species issues, endangered species, the desert tortoise in this particular case, and they kind of all came to the head in one project. I mean, do you come across these types of things in your work?
Oh, that's a big part of what I work on, actually, is, to me, what we're trying to do is stop having so much CO2 in the atmosphere, because what it's doing is increasing the temperature, which is causing extinctions. And the way that I see that we can do that is to actually increase the amount of renewable energy that we're using. And to do that, we then have to put out solar arrays, or we have to put out wind turbines. And people don't like those because they kill birds and bats. And what I have tried to get people to understand is that it's kind of like your kitchen is on fire and you're fighting the kitchen, you're fighting the fire in the kitchen so hard, the people who are worried about the birds and the bats and the turbines are fighting the fire in the kitchen while the whole house is on fire. So what I'm talking about is losing entire species, and we need to site renewables in the right places, but we know how to do that, and we're doing a very good job of it. And if we have to sacrifice a few species because of those renewables, we need to do that. I would rather sacrifice 1 or 2 species to that and save 400,000 species than the other way around. But it's a hard thing to get people to understand when you have a dead golden eagle in your hands. That is very, very difficult, and it is for me too. But we have to realize that the whole house is on fire. We have to fight the whole thing, not just the fire in the kitchen.
One thing I've been curious about too is, you know, that certainly this report, Working Group 2, cited that adaptation is already happening. People are already trying these projects in regional and local levels. Is there a chance that these adaptation projects could happen at a faster pace than the mitigation stuff has moved because they're local projects? the scale that you have to look at mitigation happening on, these little regional projects, some of them becoming models for others. Could that happen faster? I've always wondered that.
Yeah, actually, we addressed this in the Working Group 3, that adaptation doesn't require international coordination. It tends to be local. Local could be in a state or a nation, which still requires some coordination. But adaptation doesn't have this institutional obstacle that mitigation has to overcome. It's a really big obstacle. So one would expect to see adaptation. Well, adaptation is already occurring. People are adapting to the drought situation and how they manage their farms or their houses. And it can go beyond that. But the mitigation has this really tough obstacle of getting coordination, which among nations has proved to be really difficult.
All right, I think we're going to open it up to questions. I hope everybody's thought of some tough ones. We've got microphones going around. Raise your hand. Someone will come to you. I can't really see this side, so you'll have to wave especially. Hi.
Thank you very much. So, thank you all for your comments. And my question to you is that certainly in the United States, most Americans are supportive of renewable energy. Most of them are concerned about climate change. They worry about it, maybe less than we would like. But we also have seen studies that show that most Americans would flunk a basic quiz on climate and energy. They just don't know the basics. They've never learned the basics. 1 in 4 students in this country, 1 in 4 people in this country are students, and basically they're not learning about climate change, global change, or much about energy in school. What are your thoughts on the importance of education in dealing with the challenges we face, and shouldn't we have a national initiative to substantially raise our climate and energy literacy?
Well, so I'll say Dean Matson is here, and she's been leading a project on campus that's collaborative between Earth Sciences and the School of Education to try to address this issue. And the hypothesis going into that project was that exactly what you've identified. In fact, that most teachers, if you just look at the time that they were in college, that climate change wasn't taught when they were in college. It's not a basic part of scientific understanding, even for science teachers at the high school level. And so the design of that project was to both provide teachers with education, and Mike Mastrandrea, who we heard from earlier, was a big part of that effort, and then to bring that curriculum with those teachers out into their schools and do research on the effectiveness of teaching that content, integrating that content into the different classrooms. And that was a project funded by NASA that was part of a program where NASA funded many different similar projects, and so that actually is occurring at least at the initial stages.
There is also a program called ACE, which is Alliance for Climate Change Education, and I would urge you to go to their website. What they do is they actually target high schoolers, and they go into the various high schools around the nation, and they just passed the 2 million mark of teaching kids about climate change in high school. And it's a really good program, and I think that, and it's building out actually from the IPCC, because they use an awful lot of the information from the IPCC to educate them. But they do it in this, they bring rappers in, they do all these various things that, us stodgy people don't know how to do. And we can get the high schoolers to listen to a rapper. I guarantee you they don't like to listen to me. So I don't do a very good job of it.
I'll answer this on a few different levels. To start with, so the premise of the question is Americans' scientific literacy on climate change is poor. What can we do to solve it? So this turns out to be a theme that I have heard in many disciplines. So National Academy of Sciences panel a few years ago asked me to come talk to them. This was a group of mathematicians who were concerned that Americans don't understand math as well as they need to. There's historians who have said Americans don't understand history as well as they need to. And in one of my home disciplines, political scientists for decades have talked about how Americans have shockingly poor understanding of the facts and history of politics. And for example, one case was during the Vietnam War when a random sample of Americans were shown a globe and asked to find Vietnam on it. Most people couldn't. Or in another highly cited example, when you ask Americans, how long is a U.S. senator's term in office before he or she comes up for re-election? Most Americans don't know the answer to that. And what we've come to recognize in recent years is that is two key fundamental factors. One, to imagine that all Americans would be highly literate on every possible issue they could know about is completely unrealistic, right? We're all busy doing what we're doing. It's not like we're sitting around watching television entertainment so much of the time that if only we were studying up on today's topic, by the end of the month we would be that much more expert on that range of topics. So the first question is, how realistic is it? And I think to me it's not so clear that we all can hope that the country will become as informed as we might like on our issue. Secondly, more importantly, we've come to recognize how important is it that Americans be able to find Vietnam on a globe? What difference does that make? In fact, more importantly, why does it matter how many years a senator's term in office is? When the senator's up for re-election, somebody's going to tell you.
Most likely the senator.
So we need to be practical in how we decide what it is we expect people to know, what we think we need them to know. And in the arena of climate change, I would suggest that there are kind of two tiers of knowledge. That we could give Americans a quiz and a national survey that's relatively surface. Has the Earth's temperature been heating up over the last 100 years? Has human activity contributed to that happening? Is that a good or bad thing? Should action be taken? What kind of action should be taken? The natural science experts who work in this area would have a series of answers that they think are supported by scientific evidence. And my belief is that the vast majority of Americans actually get the right answer to those questions according to what the natural scientists say is the right answer. But we could ask a much more technical and complicated set of quiz questions where many people would say, I don't know the answer to that, or they would guess and they would guess incorrectly. And I think we as a group would need to say, is that a problem? Is lacking that technical knowledge really an issue, or can they rely on the people on this panel and others to be the technical experts and operate in their lives with a fundamental understanding that's correct without the technical details? So I guess I'm not so sure the premise of the question is supported by the data as I see it. More climate education for the public sounds like a fine thing, but is it a crisis because people are vastly underinformed or misinformed? Not so easy to conclude that, I would say.
Next question.
We have 10 to 15 years to act to limit emissions to 2 degrees Celsius warming world or less. I would like to ask each of you, if you could enact a federal policy in the United States, what 1 or 2 policies do you think would be most important to enact in the next 5 to 10 years?
That one's easy. What I would do would be have some kind of policy that actually levels the playing field so that the subsidies to the oil and gas companies aren't there. That's what I would do.
Let me just address that. Whether it's 2 degrees you're after, or 3 degrees or 4 degrees, my policy would be the same. And that is very quickly, I'm an economist, so this is probably expected, put in a carbon tax that's broad-based.
Yes.
Started out modest, like $10, $20 a ton of carbon, and ratchet it up over time, and match it with some reduction in government revenue somewhere. So the focus is really on doing something about the climate, not introducing all the other complicated political questions that go along with raising a tax. I think that's a simple thing to do. It's actually got a lot of support among moderates as well as progressive Republicans and Democrats. And I don't understand why it's not going anywhere, but it isn't. But that's what I do.
Can I just weigh in quickly on these two? That in our most recent survey that we did with USA Today, for the first time, we asked some questions that speak to Terry's issue. We asked about federal government subsidies to the oil industry, to the natural gas industry, and to green energy sources, you might say. And what we found was a very striking result, that Americans are in very large numbers supportive of continuing subsidies on the green side, intermediate on the natural gas side, and a very large majority of people would like to see what Terry recommended, the ending of government subsidies to the oil industry. We also asked a series of questions I've never seen asked before that in some ways are very crude. We asked, do you think making electricity from oil, natural gas, sunlight, and so on is in general a good idea, a bad idea, or neither good nor bad? And the results lined up very sharply with the subsidy answer in that about 90% of people thought it was a good idea to make electricity from green sources, and the vast majority of Americans thought it was a bad idea to make electricity from oil and coal. So the anti-fossil fuel perspective is quite widespread. On the other hand, sorry, the carbon tax idea may be a topic where the public needs more education. We don't see majority support for carbon tax as offered in various different forms. And I think, I'm speculating rather than based on data, but if the federal government raises the price of using fossil fuels either for manufacturers, generators, or consumers, the only guarantee there for the public is prices will go up. There is no guarantee that emissions will go down. We saw price of gasoline increase considerably, and we did not see, if the price of gas increased fourfold, we didn't see a chopping of driving down to 1/4 of what it had been before. People don't have to know that much to realize that, and I won't tread into the economics territory, use a term like elasticity, but that there are nonlinearities in this relationship, and at the moment, I think many people in the public are skeptical that raising prices will help the planet. Not that they are doubtful of wanting to help the planet, we can see that. But the question is there a way for a case to be made for a policy like that to convince people that it will work? And I'm not sure it has been made yet enough for the public.
I'd like to know if the public would recognize that a combination of, let's say, a carbon tax with cutting the state sales tax from 8% or whatever it is to 4%, just to use some numbers. Talk about it as a package. Would they buy that sort of thing? Because I know nobody likes a tax just by itself.
Yeah, we actually have investigated what we've thought about as revenue neutral policy. So we say, for example, taxes will be raised, or in a cap and trade system, permits will be sold, money will be generated, which means companies are paying to buy those permits. They'll pass the cost along to consumers. But the government will return that money to all Americans, for example, equally on their income tax returns. And so then what did we just say? Well, I think in the eyes of and ears and the minds of many Americans, what we said is we're going to create a big new government program which is going to charge money in taxes. Then we're going to have another government program that's going to collect up all that money and give it back to you by mailing checks to you the way President Bush did right after he was elected president. You can get a fun check in the mail, which is free money, but it really came out of you in the first place when you went to the gas pump and paid your electric bill and everything else. And I still have no guarantee that emissions have been reduced. So I think making it revenue neutral takes away one element of pain, but we've never seen a carbon tax get the kind of public support that mandates do. When you say government is going to restrict emissions, we don't have people saying, well, how could you monitor that? They buy that. That is much more popular than a market-based mechanism so far.
Well, so these numbers that were cited in the question, they really result from the global scale of the emissions, and we heard this morning from Chris and Mike and Katie about the historical emissions and the benefits of emissions, and historically the cumulative CO2 emissions are about 25% from the United States, about another quarter from the EU countries, and we've really benefited. I've benefited tremendously from those emissions, from the energy access, and the real scale of the problem is the gap in access to the benefits of energy consumption. And the way that it works in the current energy system is that there's this side effect of CO2 emissions. Not all energy sources have that side effect, but that's the current global system. And so I think the real challenge looking outside of the U.S. politics is that we have this huge debt essentially that's in the system of lack of access to fundamental benefits of energy. And if we just elevate, if globally, if everyone is elevated to look like I do in terms of my energy profile, we're going to go way past not only 2 and 3 degrees warming, but up to 4 degrees warming pretty, after not too many decades of that. And so the real tension, as I see it in a practical way, is how does the world achieve a level of well-being that does require energy access while managing the side effects in the climate system.
So what policy would you enact?
When you become an IPCC author, it's something that Chris has pointed out, they tattoo policy relevant but not policy prescriptive right on the inside of your eyeballs. So I have my eyes closed and I'm seeing that, right? That tattoo is still there even though the report is released.
We're going to go to the back.
We have a question from the internet from Tim Miller. Are you concerned that the interest and focus in adaptation can sap effort on mitigation? It seems poorer countries won't be able to afford it.
Did everybody hear it?
Can you?
Can the first part of that?
Yeah, we can't hear it.
Are you concerned that the interest and focus in adaptation can sap effort on mitigation?
Oh, absolutely not. We have to be doing adaptation and mitigation. If we're not going to adapt, then we're going to lose a lot of species. We're going to lose a lot of people. The people need to know how to survive as it's getting warmer. But it's not an either or. It's we need to do both of them, and we have to do both of them.
I think that the climate risk management framing that was laid out in the IPCC report, laid out this morning, really brings those together in a very integrated way. That really these risks we're already experiencing increased risk from the global warming that's already occurred. There's a lot of adaptation potential right now, and the more global warming occurs, the more that those risks are going to increase. So really both are required to manage the evolving risks in the climate system.
So this question goes to Terry about endangered or disappearing species. You mentioned that what struck me was not the number of species that were disappearing, but the fact that some of them are disappearing we're dependent on for our survival. That seems to me to be a point that strikes home much more to people than watching the polar bear videos and things like that. Could you give us a couple of examples that might affect us here in the room, species that would disappear, that would change our lives?
Certainly. The easiest one to talk about are the animals that actually pollinate our crops. If we lose bees, which we actually are, but that's not due to climate change, that's due to pesticide on the seeds. Anyway, if we lose the pollinators of our crops, who's going to pollinate our crops? We're going to have to get out. Right now in China, they actually are pollinating their crops with paintbrushes. They go out in the fields themselves and pollinate them because they've lost their pollinators, not due to climate change, due to other reasons. But that's the most obvious. The other thing is that we need things to clean our water. We need things to clean our air. And if we lose some of those species, we're going to be in trouble. Now, there's a redundancy in nature. So there are several different species that can do the different jobs. So maybe what can happen is one will go extinct and another will be able to go up in abundance and fill in. But if we continue pushing and pushing and pushing this buffer, it can go away. And the thing that I'm really afraid of is having to hire people to go out with paintbrushes and pollinate our crops.
Got the microphone.
I have a mic here. So I guess ask a question.
Someone
no,
has
John,
one.
as a follow-up to what you were talking about, I think you were addressing what's called fee and dividend, where you put a rising price on carbon and then give 100% of the money back to everyone on an equal basis. Under that scheme, since the 80-20 rule applies and 80% of the CO2 is generated by 20% of the population, most people will actually make more money in the dividend than they pay in the fee. Did you address that when you were asking questions about it? Did people understand that the majority of people would make more money? And if not, what do you recommend so that we can actually break through the barriers as you see them, the psychological barriers, to actually get an effective policy in place quickly?
Okay, I'll answer your second question first. You can't see it, but I have the tattoo here also. So I don't claim to have expertise in policy development, and so I won't make recommendations about how to design any particular policy. And I'm glad that Noah answered as he did, because we've done some research showing that when natural science experts wander off into the policy arena, they actually undermine their apparent credibility. So stop luring my colleagues into saying stuff they're not qualified to say. You're only going to hurt things. The other answer to your question, that's an interesting one. In the parlance that we used in our USA Today survey most recently, the way the survey question would be designed to accomplish your goal would be, economists predict that most Americans would make money from this rather than lose money. So it's a redistributive policy, we might say. Now, as it turns out, we did some experimenting. Because we can't, you can't say most Americans would. You have to say, according to economic analysis, it appears this might happen. And it's not clear whether you personally would make money or not. What we found is when we introduce that kind of uncertainty in the message, it's much less persuasive than if we describe to people inevitable consequences. And so I guess my prediction would be that we could say most Americans would make money from this. But again, the key point is, I think, let me just directly address what I think is the underlying assumption here. And that's even underlying the last question, too. That if only people realized they could benefit from doing these things, either because the planet would be better off or their wallet would be fatter, the public would be somehow different, which would then make government different or make businesses different, so the world would be a better place. I just don't see things that way. There have been lots of people who think that way over the last 15 years. If only we can convince people that they'll benefit, or if only we can convince them that they're already being harmed by climate change personally, that is what will shift something. And I just don't see the data as supporting that.
Can you just clarify that? And because you were talking before, you say that most people do support these things already. So are you saying that it wouldn't change much because they already support it? Or would you say it wouldn't matter, they're just not going to do anything? Which is it?
Yeah, what we've seen is two categories of percentages that line up with those concerned about climate change. Number one, large majorities of Americans believing in the existence and threat of the problem, and large majorities supporting some policies. And the policies they support are essentially mandate-style policies. They're not Rube Goldberg designed, if we do this here, then it'll cause this to happen, which will then cause that to happen, which eventually, years down the road, might reduce climate change by some amount unspecified. And so that's the distinction. And I think the question from many people, and which is the way I'm interpreting yours, is what could we do to sell the Rube Goldberg solution? Could we add this benefit to it, or could we add that benefit to it? And I think fundamentally the problem is, for the public, and I personally can't blame people if they say, why would I buy a device that's designed to cure my cancer when there's no guarantee that it's even addressing the cancer? All it's doing is I'm spending money on something. So that's the fundamental concern, I think.
Do we have time for just one more, I think?
There's one there.
Hi, thank you so much, all of you. I'm going to put you on the spot because Stanford has an endowment of almost $19 billion, and there is currently a very active campaign which 78% of the student body just ratified to divest that endowment from fossil fuels. So I wanted you guys to maybe talk a little bit about that. I also know there's probably a lot of faculty in the room. And to find out sort of how, because I really am genuinely interested, how are faculty participating or not in this campaign and why, and what can be done to convince that Board of Trustees in June to vote to divest?
So I'm a little older than I look. So When the apartheid divestment campaign was going on, I have a distinct memory of being in the back seat of my family's Volvo, and so I was in elementary school or something, and my mother was turning into a Shell station to get gas. I said, Mom, you can't go to Shell. They support apartheid. You can't. We got to go across the street and find a Chevron. And I went to Chevron for 2 decades after that because of the Shell is in South Africa campaign. So so don't give them your money. So I know for me as an elementary school student, it certainly had an impact on me. I think that we have. We heard how it's really hard for one person to change the trajectory of the global CO2 concentrations over the next century. I think we have a lot of opportunities here at Stanford and Silicon Valley and in the United States to really be an engine of innovation. We're clearly an engine of innovation in so many ways, and we have a lot of opportunities. Even whether it's in the policy arena, as we're seeing with our state policy, with technology, both clean tech and behavioral technology, with the science that we're doing. So I think we have a lot of opportunities to really, even if we can't control the world's CO2 emissions, we have a lot of opportunities to be leaders, and I think the campus is doing that.
I actually think there's a lot of faculty that are very much involved in this. But the reason that I am is basically what I said before. We need to level the playing field. We need to stop the subsidies. This is one of the a back-assward way to actually level the playing field. We're not going to get rid of their subsidies, so we're not going to actually invest in them. And that's one way to change it, maybe.
I think we are out of time. I've learned a lot, not just about climate change, but also about your personal tattoo habits. So please join me in thanking the panel. Thank you.